Christopher Tizzi co-presented sex selection abortion as one of the 12 new strategies representing the future of global birth control. Planned Parenthood honored Christopher Tizzi for 4 years later with the Margaret Sanger Award. And of course, she wrote the book Child Limitation, and another book which I read called The Pivot of Civilization. In chapter 5, it was entitled The Cruelty of Charity, and makes the case as to why pregnant poor women should not get prenatal care, because you get more of those kinds of people who don't meet certain criteria. And I've read the book twice. It is a devastating indictment, and it's certainly comported with the eugenists of her time. Wiesenthal writes that today, and I quote her again, there are over 160 million females missing from Asia's population. That's more than the entire population of the United States of America, female population that is. And gender imbalance, which is mainly the result of sex-selective abortion, is no longer strictly an Asian problem. In Azerbaijan and Armenia, in Eastern Europe, and even among some groups in the U.S., couples are making sure that at least one of their children is a son. So many parents now select for boys that they have skewed the sex ratio at birth of the entire world. In the global war against baby girls, renowned AEI demographer Nicholas Eberstadt wrote in the New Atlantis, and I quote him, "Over the past 3 decades, the world has come to witness an ominous and entirely new form of gender discrimination, sex-selective feticide implemented through the practice of surgical abortion with the assistance of information gained through prenatal gender determination technology. All around the world, the victims of this new practice are overwhelmingly female. In fact, almost universally female. The practice has become so ruthlessly routine in many contemporary societies that it has impacted the very population structures, warping the balance between male and female births and consequently skewing the sex ratios for the rising generation towards a biologically unnatural excess of males," close quote. Many European countries, including the United Kingdom, as well as several Asian countries, actually ban sex selection abortion. Even 4 states in America, Arizona, Illinois, Oklahoma, and Pennsylvania, proscribe it. Sex selection abortion is cruel and discriminatory and legal. It is violence against women. Most people in and out of government remain woefully unaware of the fact that sex selection abortion was a violent, nefarious, and deliberate policy, again, that was foisted upon us by the population control movement. While India has taken steps to curb these practices, indeed passing a law to ban sex-selective abortion and temper cultural facts such as the need for brides to provide a high dowry that contribute to parents looking at their daughters as a liability, these laws are largely, or irregularly, I should say, enforced. Moreover, there are laws at the state level which exacerbate the problem, mandating that parents only have 2 children, penalizing those who exceed this number, and denying benefits. This leads inevitably to sex-selective abortion, and particularly in poorer areas, female infanticide, and as parents will opt to have a son over a daughter, especially when their first child is a daughter. We hope that this hearing will help us better understand how we can play a role in curbing such horrific practices and abuses against the girl child and women. What, for example, can we do to ensure that companies based in the U.S., such as General Electric, whose ultrasound equipment is used to determine the sex of the child in utero, take steps to prevent that what should be a tool to promote life of both mother and child from being used as an instrument of death? Given the past role of U.S. agencies such as USAID in coercive population control policies, what oversight do we need to conduct to make sure that such abuses do not creep their way into existing programs? Similarly, to what extent are organizations that receive funding from the United States government implicated in such practices? What role can our State Department play beyond compiling information regarding what is occurring in India with respect to what some have labeled gendercide, to influence positively the Indian government so its reform laws and policies that exacerbate skewed sex ratios such as two-child per couple laws? By shining a light on what is happening in India with its missing girls, we hope to move forward towards a world where every woman is valued and deeply respected because of her intrinsic dignity, and where every child is welcomed regardless of his or her sex. I yield to my good friend, Dr. Burr.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, and thank you for holding this hearing, really addressing an incredibly important issue of gender inequity, not just in India, but certainly gender inequity throughout the world. And I look at this issue not just as a member of Congress. I look at this issue as a doctor, but also, the focus of this hearing is India, and I look at this issue as an Indian American. But the most important title I hold today is being the father of a daughter. And on that day where it's a girl was told to us by our doctor, that was an incredibly joyous day. When my wife and I think about how we're raising our daughter, we're raising her to be a strong woman. We're raising her to be in full control of her body and her choices. We're raising her to stand up against discrimination and not succumb to discrimination. And it's not enough that we're raising our daughter that way, but it is an imperative that every girl and every woman on this planet is empowered that same way. And at its core, that is the purpose of why this is such a critical issue. Son preference and sex selection really are products of this gender discrimination. And to address them, we really have to deal with the underlying causes of bias against women and girls. And these are incredibly complex issues. There's a complex web of socioeconomic and cultural factors that result in discrimination against girls. The chairman identified a few of those. These then manifest in sex selective practices, so we have to address those underlying causes. The only way to achieve long-lasting and real change is really to engage in community-level campaigns to change attitudes and change cultural norms that perpetuate this bias against women and girls. Other manifestations of gender discrimination are the abhorrent rates of sexual violence that occur, child marriage, domestic violence, honor killings, the denial of basic health care, including basic family planning and maternal health services. I just had the chance to visit India recently, and there are grassroots efforts, and there are some very strong Indian women that are addressing this issue at the root cause, and we'll hear from some of these strong women today and our witnesses. But when I was recently in Mumbai, I had the opportunity to visit a group called Sneha that was started by women doctors in India. The whole point was that they saw far too much gender discrimination. They saw far too much violence against girls in India. And they would go into the slums and start working with these girls to build up their self-esteem, to build up their strength. But they didn't just work with the girls. They also worked with the young men to change their attitudes, these boys, to make sure that they understood that women were equal to them. And they grew up as boys into men with an understanding of this gender equity. So it's incredibly important that we empower organizations like this that are homegrown organizations that are working at the grassroots level with girls to empower individuals. The best role for the U.S. to play is to remain a strong supporter and leader within the global community in order to best promote women's rights and the freedom of every woman to make personal decisions about her health, her body, and her future, to really empower women. The U.S. is a global leader in providing investment in the health and rights of women and girls globally. USAID's family planning programs support healthy timing and spacing of pregnancies, community-based approaches, contraceptive security, and integration with HIV and maternal and child health programs. The best way to empower a person and to prevent sex selection is actually to empower someone to plan when they're ready to start a family, to empower someone to plan when they're ready to get pregnant. That is just basic logic, and that is the best way to prevent sex-selective abortions. More than 222 million women around the world want to delay or prevent pregnancy, but they don't have access to basic contraception. In 2012, nearly 300,000 women died because of complications due to pregnancy and childbirth. Fully meeting the needs of contraceptive access and effective birth spacing would annually prevent 1.8 million deaths of children under 5. It's 25% of all child deaths. We can do better than this, and we have the tools and the methodology to help reduce this. I also want to make clear, when talking about women's human rights, including reproductive rights, coercion of any kind is unacceptable in the provision of healthcare, and international leaders should oppose any human rights abuses by working to promote women's health and rights globally. Women everywhere should have the right to determine if, when, and how often they have children. Likewise, all women deserve quality healthcare during and following pregnancy for both themselves and their families. And as a physician, I know that when women have equal access to quality healthcare, they lead a more empowered and fulfilling life. While the goal is to mitigate gender discrimination and move towards equitable women's human rights, it must be done so in a way that maintains her rights to make any reproductive health decisions that she deems appropriate for herself and her family. Finally, I'd like to submit for the record an article written by Sneha Bharat of the Guttmacher Institute regarding son preference and self-selective abortion bans.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barrett. I'd like to now go to Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling the hearing. I'm not going to have any long remarks because they're going to be calling votes, I think, in about 35 or 40 minutes, so I'm anxious to get started.
Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And this is something that is near and dear to my heart. As the chairman knows, I just applaud him on holding it. But as we start to look at the value that we place on life and little girls in particular, there's no greater tragedy than the story that is unfolding in India and in China as well, but particularly in India. And so as we see this, it's something that we must stand up and be a strong voice internationally, and also be one that is unflinching in what we condone or don't condone. There's many times that we look at the economic viability of a nation, and we condone behavior in another nation as a trading partner, and yet we wouldn't condone it here in the United States. And I think that same standard that we apply when we do not put value on life, and particularly in India on girls, not only does it create an imbalance, but it also goes further to just have horrific stories that are told day in and day out that touch my heart. It also promotes human trafficking, as we know. And my daughter, who is just turned 20, has made it a life goal to intervene in terms of human trafficking. And when you start to hear those kinds of stories on a daily basis, where they have names and they have parents and they have grandparents, it is touching. It's something that I'm committed to working with the chairman on to do all that we can do to stop this plague. And with that, I would yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows. I'd like to now welcome our distinguished witnesses to the witness table, beginning first with Dr. Matthew Connolly, a professor of history at Columbia University. He has written 2 books and many articles. One of the books that he has written is entitled Fatal Misconception, The Struggle to Control World Population, published in 2008, and is particularly relevant to our discussion today. This book was widely acclaimed when it came out and has been the point of much discussion since. Dr. Connolly has also served as a consultant to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the International Assessment and Strategy Center. We'll then hear from Dr. Sabu George. Dr. George is an expert in the field of female infanticide, girl-child neglect, and female sex selection, and has worked on these issues for over 28 years. He has written on child sex ratios, genocide, and sex selection, and on the emerging technologies of sex selection. He has undertaken extensive field research in India, was involved with the public interest litigation in the Indian Supreme Court to restrain the misuse of fetal sex determination. Dr. George has been appointed by the government of India to monitor the issue of fetal sex determination and has spoken many times again on this topic. We'll then hear from Ms. Jill McElia, who is an attorney whose experience includes extensive public service. In '08, she moved to India to serve as a field office of an international human rights organization. While living in India for 2 years, Jill and her husband were exposed to the practice of female gendercide. After extensively studying the issue and forming relationships with Indian organizations that combat the problem, they founded the Invisible Girl Project to end gendercide in India by raising global awareness concerning the loss of female lives in India, pursuing justice for lives lost, and assisting Indian organizations in the rescue and care of vulnerable Indian girls. We'll then hear from Ms. Malika Dutt, who is a founder of global human rights organization Breakthrough. Working worldwide through centers in India and the United States, Breakthrough seeks to make violence and discrimination against women unacceptable by engaging in a diverse range of actors to promote values of dignity, equality, and justice. Ms. Dutt is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on several boards and committees, including the World Economic Forum, Global Agenda Council on India, Games for Change, and the Public Interest Project. Dr. Connolly, if you could begin, if you all could come to the center, or to the table, we'd appreciate it.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm a professor of history at Columbia University, and I spent some 10 years researching population control around the world. I worked in more than 50 archives, and I interviewed some key figures in USAID, in the Indian government, in the United Nations, and leading NGOs. And what I discovered is that sex-selective abortion is not something that we can blame on backwardness. Rather than a problem of benighted people who need to be developed, it was actually development professionals who first promoted the idea of helping people to have only sons. The story begins in the 1960s, when the UN, the wealthiest foundations, and a host of Nobel Prize winners agreed that population growth was one of the gravest threats facing humanity. Both the Democratic and Republican Party platforms of 1968 agreed that population control should be an urgent priority. Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb famously predicted massive famines, and he called for using food aid to force poor countries to control population growth. But Ehrlich was a Stanford biologist, so he also called for more research. And I'm going to quote from The Population Bomb. "If a simple method could be found to guarantee that firstborn children were males, then population control problems in many areas would be somewhat eased." The head of research at the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, Stephen Polgar, was also an advocate of sex-selective abortion, and for the same reason. Bernard Berelson, president of the Population Council, considered it one of the more ethical methods of controlling population growth. Now, it's not surprising, considering some of the other methods that Berelson and Ehrlich were considering, such as introducing sterilizing agents into the food and water supply. The Population Council sent the head of its biomedical division, Sheldon Smith, to New Delhi. And it was Sheldon Siegel, I should say. It was Siegel who first introduced Indian doctors in how to determine the sex of a fetus, a practice that he promoted as a means to control population growth. The men who led population control programs, and they were all men, gave no consideration to the consequences of reducing the relative number of women. In India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, Western diplomats helped pay people to be sterilized, and Western consultants advised denial of health care and education to those who refuse. When in 1975 Indira Gandhi declared a state of emergency and used the police and army to march people to sterilization camps, foreign donors increased their support. In the span of 1 year, India sterilized some 8 million people and gave the green light to states to make sterilization compulsory. At long last, World Bank President Robert McNamara declared, India is moving to effectively address its population problem. Now instead, Gandhi was voted out of office, and in 1978, Indian feminists succeeded in having sex-selective abortion banned from government hospitals. Now, India had long been a testing ground for population control, but popular democracy limited what could be done there. It was communist China, with its one-child policy, who took population control to new extremes. Now, here again, Western advisors provided crucial support. The Chinese affiliate of the International Planned Parenthood Federation had 20 million volunteers. UN computers were crucial in calculating the number of birth permits for each commune, and UN centers trained 70,000 personnel to back them up. Periodic crackdowns peaked in 1983 when China sterilized over 20 million people and carried out 14 million abortions. The UN responded by awarding the head of the program with the first UN Population Award. Indira Gandhi was the co-winner. A bitter resistance in rural areas gradually led Chinese cadres to allow farmers with one daughter to try to have a son. But a key element in this mutual accommodation was the ultrasound machine. Ultrasound machines, which started to become imported abroad, at least some of them through international grants and loans. It's hard to know how many, because the World Bank, for instance, won't open up its files to let us find out what it was providing. But it's important to note that this wasn't just a matter of international organizations and non-governmental organizations. It was also a matter for the private sector, and especially General Electric. Producing ultrasound machines was GE's first joint venture in China. Now, to be sure, both India and China have tried to stop the practice, but these governments long sought to make parents ashamed merely for having more than one or two children when they did not actually make it illegal. Now, why should we be surprised if couples now ignore government decrees, especially when they would limit their ability to plan their own families? Now, similarly, for decades, American experts and activists advised Asian countries to adopt these manipulative and coercive measures, employed untested and risky medical technologies, and used Western loans and grants to pay for it all. Now, the results were so disastrous that in India, the term family planning itself is completely discredited, and advocates must use euphemisms like family welfare. Now, we should not, therefore, expect that Asian countries will be eager to hear our advice. But it's precisely because the U.S. took a leading role in population control that we cannot pretend we have no responsibility for the consequences. The first step is simply to acknowledge this history. It was only after a long, hard struggle that family planning organizations rejected population control and rededicated themselves to the principles of reproductive rights and health. As long as these organizations refuse to come to terms with this history, they will be vulnerable to accusations that they are still trying to control people instead of empower them. Now, the world is a very different place, and these organizations are very different from what they once were. But the future will present radically new challenges and new dangers. Now, we no longer face a population explosion, after all, and more countries are adopting incentives to boost birth rates, and they may be tempted to try more coercive measures. My great fear is that instead of population control to reduce population growth, we're going to see the return of pro-natalist programs and policies like we saw in the 1930s in places like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And many individual couples are desperate to have children, of course, and this is especially the case in African countries which have stratospherically high infertility rates. And in wealthy countries, some are tempted to use biotechnology to have superior offspring, or even to outsource their pregnancies to India. Now, these issues pose excruciating ethical choices, but none turn on the intractable issue of when life begins. Instead, they turn on something no less fundamental: the quality of life, and the way our choices can make life more or less meaningful. And my hope is that pro-life and pro-choice people of good faith will begin to find common ground. We must work together to ensure that everyone has access to birth control and the help they need to bear and raise children without coercion or manipulation. We might agree that society has an interest in potential life to be balanced against the rights of the mother, and together fight sex-selective abortions worldwide. And we could demand that infertility treatment become part of comprehensive health care for all, in Africa no less than the United States. To conclude, it's not enough merely to insist on choice. Choices can be conditioned by design or default in ways that lead to new kinds of oppression. And the defense of life can also become a symbol without substance if the effect is to drive people to breed. Reproductive freedom is a cause that can and must stand on its own, now more than ever. but it can only take flight if it is animated by a vision of social justice in which every one of us is conceived in liberty and created equal. Thank you.
Dr. Connolly, thank you very much for your testimony. Dr. George.
I'm most grateful to the U.S. Congress for holding this hearing. Particularly, I thank the Chair Chris Smith, Representative Mr. Bera, and Mr. Weber, and Mr. Meadows, and Mr. Marino for coming despite a crucial debate on Syria in the House. I'm greatly honored to be here, to be invited by a committee which was once chaired by a great congressman like Tom Lantos of California. My name is Sabu George, and I've been working on protecting girl children for last 28 years. I've lived and worked in villages for more than 7 years. I've had the great privilege of studying public health and nutrition. I lived in US for 9.5 years. And I'm delighted that, a lot of the remarks which Mr. Chris Smith spoke about the early history is something I don't need to repeat. No, and in terms of the challenges, in terms of what population control faces today, Mr. Bera has addressed that. So I think, we have many things which I need to state, which has already been said. Yes, we are dealing with sex selection has become a genocide. More girls in India and China are eliminated every year than the number of girls born in America. Today you have 2 million girls born in America, but we have more than that being eliminated in India and China. Particularly in the Indian context, over the last decade, India eliminated more than 6 million girls. This is much larger than the number of Jews eliminated during the Holocaust. And I think what I would like to emphasize very clearly, we have a history of discrimination against women for several centuries, but what the kind of magnitude of discrimination what we are seeing in the country today has no parallel. And I think Chris Smith has emphasized it. And therefore, what I would like to emphasize is that what we are facing today in eastern India, southern India, in Kashmir, in Himalayan states, which did not have the forms of discrimination against women as in northwest India, we are seeing these parts. So the role of the medical profession, the role of corporations cannot be ignored. And I think we have seen emergence of consequences like forced polyandry, which is hardly talked about in northwest India. Several men sharing one wife, which is common. The levels of violence against surviving women are increasing, and what is most disturbing for us is that in the coming decades, what progress women had achieved in education and employment opportunities will indeed become very strongly affected because of the threat of violence in homes and outside homes. I think history of sex selection, all of you have heard, but I think, coming to the corporations, Chairman Chris Smith had talked about the role of GE. I mean, you have had the Wall Street Journal write about it. Now, I think I would like to look at the role of Google, which today promotes new technologies of sex selection. Today, they're advertising new products long before they are proven to be effective. We would appeal to all of you to ensure that the US corporations respect Indian law. And recently we saw this case of online advertisement which Google was caught in a sting, and the Justice Department had a major settlement, got $500 million fine from Google. We hope that US corporations will abide by the laws in our country. I have a petition against Google in the Indian Supreme Court. We have had the kinds of arguments like Google India tells us to the court, we don't know who owns Google America. So we hope, sir, that that American corporations do not benefit from the Holocaust, what's happening in our country. We have a good law against sex selection, and I would like to emphasize, sir, that there is a state like in Maharashtra, which is one of the biggest states, where because of the work of a good lawyer like Varsha Deshpande, more than 50 doctors have been convicted, which is a great thing in our Indian legal system, which goes on perpetually. And so law makes a deterrence. Unfortunately, rest of India, we don't have that. And we do need to ensure that changing mindsets is one part, but ensuring in the context of a genocide that laws need to be followed. And you have mentioned about funding USAID, you had mentioned about international organizations, sir. I think what I would like you to be very, very clear, sir, is that the history, we should not forget the recent history. We have had times when USAID was thrown out of the country because the Indian government didn't like it. I think it's extremely important, sir, not to just to focus on cutting funding to USAID, cutting funding to international organizations, but engaging with the government, dealing with what needs to be done, because ultimately, it's extremely easy in our country to raise passions against any big powers, and which would not solve the problems of our millions of our poor women. And sir, please do not see sex selection, which is an extreme form of violence against women, as a problem of abortion. It's extremely important in the Indian context, where entire responsibility of contraception is put on to women, that where men don't accept any responsibility, that women do have to have rights for abortion in our country. And so we request that the American government, the American Congress, does indeed actively engage with the government of India, with the Indian Parliament, and ensure that this Holocaust does not continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. George. Ms. Miguelia.
It is Macalier, thank you. Very good. I think you're one of two people I've ever met who actually pronounced it right. That's true. Chairman Smith, members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for inviting me to testify today about an issue that I've become very passionate about, and that's India's missing girls. As you heard in my biography from Chairman Smith, I was living in India, I'm an attorney, and I was working for a human rights organization. My husband's a pharmacist, and he was doing medical camps in India at the time. And that's when we were exposed in 2009 to the practice of infanticide, which Chairman Smith talked about, which is the killing of a little girl when she's born just because she's a girl. My husband was in a rural village in South India, and he noticed that there were all these little boys running around, and there were no little girls. He learned that in this village, the boys outnumbered the girls 8-1 because of the practice of infanticide. He met a young woman I'll call Prima today. Prima was the 12th daughter born to her parents. Her mother felt intense pressure to have a son, and so she would become pregnant, give birth to a little girl, and then she and her husband would kill their own daughter. Once again, she would become pregnant because there was pressure from her husband and her in-laws to bear a son. She would have a daughter, and she and her husband would kill their own little baby girl. They did this 11 times, and then they had Prima. And they decided, well, I guess we're not going to have a son. I guess we'll spare Prima's life. This is a face, this is a name behind the reality of infanticide in India. And when we were exposed to it in 2009, my husband and I decided we must move to action, to do whatever we can in a country that we grew to love, to combat this terrible practice, which is extreme discrimination against little girls that has resulted in this gendercide, which is the genocide of women and girls in India. And that is when we founded Invisible Girl Project. And our mission is to end gendercide in India. We do this through partnering with indigenous organizations that are already doing wonderful work. We support these Indian organizations to combat this gendercide. And so through our work, we've learned, of course, that infanticide is just a small part of this gendercide. As Chairman Smith mentioned, feticide, sex-selective abortion is also a huge part of it. I sit before you today, I'm 8.5 months pregnant with my second daughter. If I were a woman in India today, I would receive intense pressure, strong-arming, most likely, from my husband and my in-laws to receive a sex determination ultrasound to determine whether I was having a boy or girl. This is illegal in India. The Prenatal Diagnostic Techniques Act of 1994 made this illegal. It is illegal to have an ultrasound and determine whether you're having a boy or girl. But the law is not upheld. And so, as a pregnant woman, if I were in India, my in-laws would likely be pressuring me to have this sex determination test done. If I complied and then realized I was having a little girl, I would then receive intense strong-arming to have an abortion just because I'm pregnant with a daughter. This practice is so widespread throughout India. There are estimates that there are 2,000 sex-selective abortions performed daily in India of little girls. There's an estimate that there are 2 million little girls who are aborted annually just because they're girls. And I talk about the coercion that these women face from their in-laws, from their husbands, to bear a son, because coercion is a huge part of this. These women are denied any choice. They are forced to break the law, to have sex determination tests done, to have sex-selective abortions performed, and this is against the law in India. The law even recognizes the coercion. As an attorney, of course, I've read through this act thoroughly. I've read through the Supreme Court decisions on this act. And it's important to note that the law recognizes the coercion by family members. Family members can even be found guilty of breaking the law. Unfortunately, though, this law is not upheld. And so sex-selective abortion is widespread and it's proliferating. As such, gendercide, with infanticide, feticide, neglect, as Chairman Smith mentioned, accounts for such a huge chasm in the population. There's trafficking, there's marriage of child brides, because 37 million men, as the 2011 census pointed out, there are 37 million more men than women in India. And these 37 million men have no brides. They have no one to marry. And so women are trafficked in from other countries. They traffic children to become brides. And as you know, sex trafficking has become a huge issue in this country. People want to fight sex trafficking, but people don't realize the root is gendercide, especially in India, because there is this chasm in the population. There are studies that also show that violence against women is a result of gendercide, of the chasm in the population. We're all familiar with the rape case that happened in Delhi, where there was a young woman who's a student who was raped on the bus and later murdered. Well, she died because of the rape, this gang rape. I will argue before you today that violence such as this is because of this chasm in the sex ratio between men and women, which is all a result of gendercide. As Americans, we've taken the lead in asking countries to report on how they're combating trafficking. Isn't the murder of girls and women, which leads to trafficking, every bit as important? Countries must report on what they're doing to save the lives of their daughters, and that's what I ask you today. Just as my husband and I were compelled in 2009 to start Invisible Girl Project to save the lives of little girls in India, I ask that you take the lead, that your ears be open today, and that you fight to save the precious lives of voiceless little girls who cannot save themselves. Let's ask these countries that have these huge chasms in their sex ratios, that are allowing this gendercide to go on, to report what they're doing to save their daughters, so that girls no longer go missing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I'd like Ms. Dutt.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, Representatives Weber, Meadows, and Bera. Oh, we missed Representative Meadows. He just walked out the door, but thank you, the rest of you, for being here. And really, thank you so much for your attention to this very, very critical issue facing women in India and around the world. As you've all already pointed out, gender-based discrimination is a global pandemic. It is the largest human rights global pandemic, and it takes many, many different forms, including dowry, honor killings, and sexual assault, rape. Just yesterday/today, the Delhi court handed down a verdict on the gang rape that my co-presenter just referenced. And really, all of these forms of gender-based discrimination and violence stem from this larger issue of patriarchy and son preference that plagues India and so many other parts of the world. And gender-biased sex selection is just another pernicious form of gender inequity, a harmful practice which, as we have already heard, has led to a very alarming decline in the number of girls in parts of India and, in fact, in many other parts of the world. I'm president of Breakthrough, a human rights group that seeks to make discrimination and violence against women and girls unacceptable. Our approach is to use multimedia tools along with community engagement to really try and transform the cultural norms and social practices that violate human dignity and that really underlie the many violations and abuses that women and girls face. We believe that human rights must begin in our hearts, in our homes, and in our own practices. That human rights, as Eleanor Roosevelt so eloquently said, begin in small places close to home. Over the last 12 years, we've learned several lessons, and based on that, I offer the following recommendations to this committee. The United States must assume a position of global leadership in confronting the underlying factors that foster gender discrimination. First, by sustaining and strengthening investments in global health and development, and second, by advocating for the equity and women of girls to be at the center of the global development agenda. This approach, of course, is consistent with human rights instruments such as the International Conference on Population and Development's Program of Action, which the United States has also endorsed. Breakthrough is currently working to address the issue of gender-based sex selection in Haryana, which at 877 females to 1,000 males has the lowest sex ratio in India. What we're doing in Haryana is to engage multiple community stakeholders that include government officials, that include media professionals, women and men in rural and urban areas, medical practitioners, educational professionals, young people, doing research for them to really look at the underlying causes of gender-based sex selection so that we can challenge patriarchal norms and son preference. This integrated approach is increasingly being viewed as an effective one by UN agencies, governments, and many others. In order to figure out the best communications and advocacy strategy, we've conducted comprehensive baseline research. And what we found through our interviews with these different stakeholders is what all of you have already pointed out. There are complex factors, social, economic, and political, that include dowry and inheritance laws, lack of women's agency in relation to safety, security, and sexuality, ineffective implementation of our existing laws, and lack of women's financial independence that lead to gender-biased sex selection. To be clear, bans on access to reproductive health are not an appropriate solution. Similarly, research has found that while technologies used for sex selection have compounded the problem, they're not the root cause. So we believe very strongly that access to voluntary family planning and safe and legal abortion remains vital to fulfilling women's human rights. In other words, we should not take away the rights of women and girls to promote their rights. As was well documented by the professor to my right, gender bias in India is also rooted in historical acts of discrimination, including forced sterilization, coercive reproductive health programs, and many other violations. I have been part of the global women's movement to ensure that these kinds of historical abuses are condemned and that women's rights are universally upheld. And I deeply believe that in India, the largest democracy in the world, the path forward to reducing widespread gender inequity and sex selection is through comprehensive and community-based culture change solutions that have to be driven by Indian stakeholders themselves. The most critical contribution that this committee can therefore make now is to sustain U.S. investments in global health and development. Current American aid to India helps ensure access to education, food, water, energy, and healthcare, including safe childbirth and voluntary family planning for some of the most vulnerable women and girls in the country. All of these elements are vital to improving the status and rights of women and girls, and with it, to reduce the underlying causes of son preference. Once again, I would like to extend my thanks to all of you for bringing attention to this very important issue.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dutt. Let me begin the questioning, if I could, with you.
Sure.
You know, Jill McElroy? McElroy. I know a McElroy, but not a McElroy. Made a point in her testimony that some 2 million girls' lives are snuffed out through sex selection abortion in India every year, which is a horrifying number. I mean, we and I personally, with the killing fields that occurred in Darfur, which is probably about 500,000, spent an excessive amount of time, as did other interested members of Congress and human rights organizations, to try to bring attention to and stop the slaughter in Darfur.
Mr. Chairman, it's 5,479 per day.
That's extraordinarily number of loss of girls' lives simply because they're girls. So I find it a disconnect, if I could, with all due respect. I believe that pernicious bias and prejudice against the girl child and women in India or anywhere else begins in the womb, especially when such large numbers of girls are slaughtered either through chemical poisoning or through dismemberment. And I know methods of abortion are often encapsulated with phrases or sloganized into choice rhetoric, but the actual deed, with all due respect, is dismemberment, pills that make it the girl child or boy unable to continue living inside the womb, like RU46, first starves them to death. Then the second action of that chemical combination is to cause the expulsion of the girl from the womb. And then there's dismemberment, which is either D&E. And I have been involved in the pro-life movement for 40 years, and I am steadfast about human rights being from womb to tomb. I agree when you say, as you said so eloquently, gender-based sex selection is another pernicious form of gender inequity, harmful practice that has led to an alarming decline in the number of girls in parts of India and other parts of the world. And then later on in your testimony, you argue for continuance of abortion. We have that same argument going on here, as you know, and you are here, but in the United States, Planned Parenthood was found through an undercover operation to be telling, and I've watched them all of the undercover women who were pregnant went in, were told that if they wait until 5 months, do an ultrasound, if it is a girl, kill it. And one of those Planned Parenthood clinics is right next to my office in New Jersey. I find a horrible disconnect there between empathy, love, compassion, and respect for the girl child in utero, and then a willingness under the rubric of freedom of choice to say, but nevertheless, she can be killed through dismemberment, chemical poisoning, or some other way that is an act of violence. So help me to understand how you can argue both, if you will. Again, and I'll conclude on this before going, we've seen the devastating consequences. India itself has outlawed it, as has the UK, 4 states, as I noted. We're trying to do it here. We have failed. And it is growing in its incidence and prevalence. It seems to me that if you treat the girl with such impunity and prejudice while she's in utero, why do we expect at the event of birth, and it's only an event that happens to a child, it's not the beginning of life, that somehow, poof, we're gonna now show respect for that girl. That kind of prejudice then continues, because it has been it began right from the start.
So thank you for raising all of those very, very important points. I'd like to share a story with you, if I may. In 1985, a very dear friend of mine was in a car accident in Bombay, and she, because she was so badly injured, ended up in a public hospital, which didn't have the greatest of amenities. And so several of us who were friends spent time taking turns to be at the hospital with her, because that was the only way we could ensure the kind of care that she needed. And so I had night duty for 2 nights in that hospital. And she was placed in the women's wing because that's where all of the women were. And it was one of those sort of life-altering experiences for me, because the vast majority of the other women in that ward were young women who had been burnt for dowry. So there must have been at least 200 women in that ward. I would say 80% of them were suffering from deep third-degree burns. They were covered with bandages, in enormous pain. Many of those women were on the floors on mattresses because there weren't enough beds. And because I was on duty at night, I spent most of my time running around the ward chasing of rats that were trying to nibble at and eat the young women that were on the floor, or then trying to get nurses there to give them pain medication because they were in so much pain and they were screaming so much. I share this story with you to say that I believe that in order to empower women and in order for women to be able to exercise the choices that they need to make about their lives and who they are, that the right to abortion has to be part of that narrative, because women are so deeply disempowered that to take away rights in order to give them rights just doesn't make sense to me. I totally understand what you're saying about the problem of gender-based sex selection and how we're missing all of these young girls. But I'm not agreeing with you on the cause and effect of this. It's not that causes the kind of violence and discrimination that women and girls face. It's a life cycle problem. If you come with me to Varanasi and meet the widows who live on the ghats and the banks, who have been sent there because they cannot live at home anymore after their husbands are dead. Just today, we saw the sexual assault, rape conviction come down. I mean, I have worked with and dealt with young girls and women who have been raped and violated in all kinds of ways. And so this is my life's work. And again, I would say that in order to promote women's human rights, you can't take away rights from them.
I would just say very briefly, and I, of course, respect you. Many of us do see birth as an event. We look at people like Dr. Bernard Nathanson, who founded NARAL, and was he did more abortions than perhaps anyone else at his time. And when he stopped doing them, he wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine, "I've come to the agonizing conclusion that I have presided over 60,000 deaths." He ran the largest abortion clinic in New York City at the time. Those of us on the pro-life side, with respect to your position and to you, do see abortion as a horrific form of violence. It's not a benign deed. It either dismembers, hacks to death, D&E abortions, and they are done, in a mid to later term in the gestational cycle. And of course, sex selection usually isn't done until about the 5th month, when a gender determination can be made. So these are big kids being dismembered, and they die suffering excruciating pain. We had a bill on the floor called the Pain Capable Unborn Child Protection Act, and the overwhelming body of evidence, and there's people who disagree, and there always will be, say that these children feel pain. So not only are their lives snuffed out violently, they do feel pain. And again, when it's being done for the sole purpose or overriding purpose of ridding that family of a girl, that is a form of discrimination. So I just convey that to you from my heart to yours as a deep concern. Now, did the Ford Foundation ever embrace, because I know you worked there, sex-selected abortion?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, by the time that I got to the Ford Foundation, which was at the end of 1996, the foundation had a very strong reproductive rights program. And, having been part of the women's movement that was involved in the Cairo conference, where we actually challenged a lot of the population and coercive reproductive policies that were described by the professor earlier, I mean, very much part of that movement. There's no way I would have gone to the foundation if that's what their policies were. One of the things that I did in Cairo was actually convene a tribunal where women from around the world testified as to their reproductive rights and the abuses that they had experienced, either at the hands of government policies or because of their denial to access to reproductive rights and reproductive health services, including, so many of the issues that women face simply because of poverty and lack of access to basic health care.
I was actually at the population conference for a week and was part of the delegation under the Clinton administration, and I was shocked, dismayed, and sickened that Madame Peng Pei-yung, who I met with on another occasion in Beijing, who ran the coercive population control program in China, and argued that there was nothing coercive about the Chinese program, told me that, and said the UNFPA is here, and they give it a good, clean bill of health as well. In plain day, reminded me of those who said during the Stalin years in Ukraine that there was no effort to destroy so many people through famine, a deliberate policy of extermination of Ukrainians. And then there were people who then say, oh, but that didn't happen. Well, it is happening in China. She was feted and lifted up as a great leader at the Cairo Population Conference, even though she's one of the architects and was an aggressive implementer of the egregious one-child per couple policy. Let me just ask one final question because of time. I want everybody to, Dr. Conley, you might want to comment what I was saying. I can tell by, yes, please.
Well, as an historian, I'm not always well informed about the present, but I will say that for those who'd like to do research, on the history of how the Ford Foundation worked in the field of population control and how the Ford Foundation changed, in the ways that that Monica Dutt has explained to us, you can just go to the archive and it's remarkably open, and you can read file upon file of internal memos and correspondence and so on. On the other hand, if you want to probe the history of the Roman Catholic Church and its role in limiting reproductive rights and supporting pronatalist policies, as I have in Rome and trying to work in the Vatican archives, you meet stone wall after stone wall. So I think that as an historian, to be totally honest, I think the Ford Foundation has come a long way. The Vatican, I think it's less clear.
Okay, let me go to Dr. Barr, and then if we have time, we'll do a second round.
Great. Now, I'll try to keep my questions short so Randy can ask some questions. I think there's general agreement across all of us that coercion in any form is wrong and should be unacceptable. Whether it's done at the population level or whether it's done at the individual level, coercing someone to do something that is not what they want to do, is just a basic fundamental principle. And the opposite of coercion is, how do you empower people to, be strong, be able to make their own decisions, be able to stand up to make their own decisions, to have the freedoms to make their own decisions. The subject of this hearing goes to the most basic of fundamental freedoms: control over your body, control over making the decisions that are most sacred to you, control over your reproductive freedom. So, I think all of us are unanimous that any sex-selective practices are heinous in how they're put out there, and certainly we should, as an institution, do what we can to minimize sex-selective practices across the world. But these are complicated issues that have complicated roots. I think Dr. Connolly painted out some of the historical background. Ms. Dutt, talked about where we are today, and these are issues that are incredibly complex, that require local solutions, that require solutions that are homegrown, and whatever we can do as an institution to help empower that. Let me ask Ms. Dutt a question. You did point out a number of the root causes and the complexity of why gender discrimination, why discrimination against women and girls in India is so prevalent and so complex. Given your expertise, in this area. Can you speak about some of the best practices that are homegrown in India? You touched on your program, but those practices that are empowering women, that are providing reproductive health services to them, and really kind of from the ground up that are in India.
So in terms of some of the lessons learned, and I will also ask Sabu to weigh in because he's done so much work in this area as well. I think that the best results really emerge from programs that involve the local community in making the program decisions and in making sure that the most marginalized amongst the groups have access to those services. I think that the other thing that's very important is that you have to take a rights-based approach to providing services to women. If you merely look at it as a health practice without actually looking at the underlying issues that may enable or prevent a woman from even being able to go to the doctor. I mean, you can't just set up a clinic without looking at the factors that enable women and girls to visit the clinic in the first place. So it's those kinds of solutions that really take into account the entire community and also bring in multiple stakeholders. Let me give you another example. One of the campaigns that we did a few years ago was called Ring the Bell, which challenged domestic violence by engaging men and boys to become part of the solution. So we tried to shift men and boys' engagement, simply being seen as perpetrators, to saying, listen, you have a responsibility to be a part of the solution. And that reframing of the issue has led to a very different kind of conversation around domestic violence in the states in which we've been working. We've also seen a 15 to 20% increase in reporting on domestic violence and an increase in awareness about the act as a result of taking a broader stakeholder approach. In our work on early marriage in Bihar and Jharkhand, we've just launched a campaign where we are really talking to the fathers, because what we've discovered is that they're the ones who are making the decisions around when their girls and when young women get married. And we're having a lot of success in engaging fathers to come to the table and say, we are the ones who have to start making some of these differences in order to move forward.
Dr. George, let me ask you a question. You touched on the history of some of the laws that India has enacted. What do you think the Indian government has done well? And then conversely, what are the things that you would suggest the Indian government should be doing?
Thank you, Mr. Bera. As a doctor and as an Indian, and I think you should look at the role of the medical profession in our country. Since they're so organized and so powerful, they tend to put a lot of pressure on the government. So where, those of us who are campaigning against the misuse of the medical ethics and technology, etc., have, like in the case of Maharashtra, there's been quite an impact there because the laws are upheld. So we cannot give up on the judicial systems and this thing. It's a very slow process. I spent a significant amount of time in the courts. 3rd of September, I was there in the Supreme Court. Now, 17th I'm missing because I'm just taking a few days to go back home. So what I'm trying to say is that, laws make a difference, just like what Malika said. Today was the conviction of the people who were involved in the December rape. Now, in that case, there is a public outrage in the country today that rape is unacceptable. But we do not see sex selection as a crime. So therefore, yes, sorry.
I was just going to say, so just to make sure I'm hearing this correct, I was just in India a few weeks ago when there was another rape case in Mumbai. And you saw this huge outcry of how this is unacceptable. Is it accurate then you're not seeing that same level of public outrage on sex selection?
Yes, sir. We have made some progress in terms of seeing this as an issue of, till 2001, there was not even much concern about the problem of sex selection. Then when the results of the census came out, we did see. So there is some discourse, and in areas like Punjab, Haryana, etc., which has been very badly affected, like we are looking at ratios of 700s, we have much more discourse. But what we are frightened is the rest of the country, have to follow reaching these levels before the society responds.
Would you suggest that that's a starting point, though, that actually engaging the public, creating this public outrage or this public, either one of you, is that the starting point where the public actually gets engaged and said, this is unacceptable?
I think that's a very critical point. I think that we have to look at multiple intervention points. I think the law is very important, implementing the law is very important, but certainly creating public outrage is a critical piece of the story. I mean, that's one of the reasons why Breakthrough believes in a culture change approach. And so we are in the process of testing different communication routes and are looking to actually launch a campaign that is India's quest for its missing girls, and engaging young people in this sort of massive search where we really begin to question the underlying factors that are leading to this problem in the first place.
Thank you. Weber.
This question is for you. I think you said that sex trafficking, or maybe it might have been you, Ms. Macri, the root is gendercide, or which one of y'all said that? Okay. That's an interesting comment when you say it's gendercide. So let me go back to you, Ms. Dutton. You said that some of the women in the hospital where you went that night were burned for dowry. Well, they were burned because they didn't have one, they didn't have enough one, because they were going to have to come up with one. Explain that.
So, for whatever cultural reason, the way in which many women who have been in their marital homes are disposed of are by being burnt. I mean, this is,
So they're not shot with a gun or stabbed to death, or
right, they're burnt. I mean, in the
they're
U.S. we
burned to
have
death.
larger homicide rates with
I got you.
guns. So in India we have burns. So that's the phenomenon that I was
got you.
referring to.
Okay. And then you said in your paper that you're for safe and legal abortion. Of course, as Chairman Smith pointed out, abortion is anything but safe for the unborn child. Would you agree with that?
I think that this is one of those situations where, like I've said before, I really deeply believe that for women, if we're going to ensure that they have access to their full human rights, that access to abortion, safe legal abortion, has to be a part of the full complement.
The right to kill that unborn child is a human right.
This is one of those conversations where we could turn this into going around in circles.
Well, no,
I really believe.
I'm getting to a point here. It's about the volume. It's been mentioned here today numerous times that there's 786 women to 1,000 men, or 786 girls to 1,000 boys. Isn't that about the accurate? Wasn't that about the right ratio?
Yeah, Representative Weber, but I think that the point that I'm trying to make is that in order to deal with a wrong, you don't do another wrong. And so you don't take away the rights of women in order to empower women.
But I would submit this. If truly the numbers, the discrepancies of marrying women, that's what's cited in the paperwork over and over again, that sounds like they're calling our votes, then would you be okay, given if a woman wants to terminate her pregnancy because it's not handy, not good timing, to have another child, it's inconvenient. You think that's a human right?
I think that given the many ways in which women are controlled and exploited and abused, it's very, very important for women to have full control over their own reproduction.
So she has full control to terminate that pregnancy because it's inconvenient, time-wise.
I think women need to make the decisions that they need to make about their bodies and their lives and the timing of their children. And that decision really needs to reside with
I'm going to take that
women.
as a yes, since you're talking about safe and legal abortion. And so if a woman decides that it's inconvenient to have a child because she's going to have a job, she's going on a trip, she's got other children that need her, whatever reason she deems it inconvenient, she terminates that pregnancy. That's what you've said. You've written it in paper, safe and legal abortion. So let's do this. 786 girls to 1,000 boys. Would you be okay if they went ahead and did selective abortion on males to try to even up those numbers?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I have never been asked that
I mean,
question.
if a mother says, look, you know what? Our country has too many males. So here's a male. And so now the trend is going to go the other way. We're going to terminate males. Would that be okay?
You know, you've really opened a very interesting line of thought in my mind around this question. Like I said, nobody's ever asked me this question before. At the end of the day, I would just come back to making my earlier point. I really do not believe that taking away rights from women is the way to empower them. If we're going to support the human rights of women and girls, we've got to support the human rights of women and
Do
girls.
you support the rights and human rights of men and boys as well?
Absolutely, and
And you would not be okay with swinging the pendulum the other way and aborting all the males.
Absolutely not. And, you know, Breakthrough's mission statement says that we seek to make violence and discrimination against women and girls unacceptable so that all of us can live lives of dignity, equality, and justice.
But violence against unborn women or men or children is okay.
You know, women really need to have the right to make those decisions for themselves because the consequences to them when they cannot are enormous.
So if a woman wants to kill her baby because it's a boy and she's aware of this discrepancy of numbers, that's okay. That's her choice.
Women must have access
That would,
to
in
safe and
essence-
legal abortion and full access to safe health care.
That, in essence, would be reverse sex selection, would it not? We see the opposite of what you're seeing, what you're here today to discuss.
I think that it should be clear from my remarks that the idea behind promoting women's human rights is not at the expense of men, but to get us to a world where all of us can really live to our full potential.
Well, I would submit that there's 5,479 girls a day in India that aren't getting to any kind of world or any kind of life.
And you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't think that any of us, and I certainly I'm not condoning gender bias sex selection. We do have a crisis. We have a very serious problem. And that's one of the reasons why we are putting so many of our organization's resources behind it. I think the only place that you and I are disagreeing, Representative Weber, is the solutions to it. But I think we're totally in agreement about the scale of the problem and what we need and the fact that we really need to pay attention to it.
You've already testified here today that you've never thought about if it went the other way where they were aborting baby boys.
You know, the thing is that nobody's framed the question that way, and I thought that was a very interesting way to ask it.
Well, think about that, because these are children, and if women decide that they've got too many males in India, then under the idea that women's rights are to terminate their pregnancy for whatever reason, then it could go the other way. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Marino?
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, panel. I'd like to explore a little bit about the government's role from the national level down to the local level. I read an article not too long ago, and I just looked it up to make sure I had the facts right. Some time ago, there was, I may have the ages wrong, a 5, 7, or a 9-year-old, an 11-year-old, 3 girls that were missing. They were found a couple of days later in a well, dead. The mother reported them the day that they went missing to the local police. The police did nothing about it. And the village then protested, actually blocked some type of road bypass, and got another level of government to look at it. And then it was determined that they were raped and then murdered. Let's look at the national level. Is there a serious attempt by the national government, by the Prime Minister, by the members of the legislature, and by law enforcement to address this issue, or is there a blind eye turned to this? Anyone?
If I may, I want to respect and give Dr. George also time. But as I mentioned before, I'm an attorney. And in my experience in working with a human rights organization in India, I couldn't practice law, but I had a team of Indian attorneys who were working for me. And in this international human rights organization, what we did in the south of India was we rescued people from bonded labor slavery. And so I became familiar with the judicial system, the whole process in India of what starts a case. I became familiar with the intense amount of corruption that exists and how you can get the public justice system to work for the poor. So to answer your question, the laws are in place on a national level. I mentioned the PNDT Act, which is a very good law that outlaws sex-selective abortion. In addition, these crimes against women are illegal in India. And so on a national level, the laws are in place.
So why aren't they enforced?
So they're not enforced, I would argue, because a lack of political will on the state level, on the smaller level, because there is corruption that goes on. You can easily
let me back it up a
bribe.
little. I was a prosecutor for 19 years. I was a district attorney in Pennsylvania for 10 years, and I was a United States attorney with George W. Bush. And I prosecuted cases myself, even as the U.S. attorney. Murder cases, rape cases, drug cases, organized crime. And I'm sure the system works fairly similar in your country to the extent of money funnels down from the national government to the states, correct? Okay.
Correct.
So what better way to force the lower levels of government to follow the law and to enact the law by saying funding is going to stop for this project, for whatever money funnels down. So I'm getting the impression that if the national government wanted this really to occur, they could have an enormous amount of influence over it, instead of saying, well, the problem is with the states. And the states are saying the problem's with the smaller entities of government. I can't imagine that you have there are national prosecutors, correct? Please.
Thank you, Mr. Marino. We have a federal system, like, and there's always always conflict between states' rights and unions' rights, just like what you have in the U.S. But see, our first difficulty, like what you talked about rape. Now, in the last few months, like what we heard about the December rape and what Amy Berra said about the Bombay rape recently, it is becoming unacceptable politically for the political parties to support these kinds. For instance, just recently, one of the most well-known spiritual leader was put in jail because he was involved in rape. So what I'm saying is this would not happen, say, even a year ago. So therefore, we are seeing progress. But, given the kind of, injustice we have had for several centuries, and given the virtual absence of women in public life, like I come from the state Kerala, which for over 140 years have had the largest proportion of women in our state. We have women live 5 years longer than men. The longest life expectancy in our state. But the role of women in public life is very limited. We hardly have women in legislatures. So what I'm trying to say is that it's a process we have to struggle with, in terms of we cannot just give up just because there is a failure at many levels. But what is interesting today, young people have decided in our country it's not acceptable.
Well, apparently the people from the village who protested and were made it known that they wanted something done about this had an impact. Is it, and please don't take this pejoratively, and I'm not criticizing. I'm a firm believer that I've said over the years that the United States cannot impose its form of democracy on other countries because of the simple ideology and the history of that country. Life is very valued here in the United States, very valued. Can you tell me, from your perspective, Dr. George, in India, how does the value of life in India compare to the value of life in the United States?
I think it's much more easier, sir, to let's look at the Holocaust. Now, when the Holocaust was happening, it took many, many years of denial. Like even in the late 30s, for instance, no country was willing to take on the Jews.
Right.
So what I'm trying to say is that now, by the time when the American government was informed of it, you had Justice Brandeis going to meet the President FDR and talking about what is happening in these concentration camps. Still, there was a lot of delay. So what I'm trying to say is...
But it wasn't happening in the United States. Not that that is an excuse, because I wrote an extensive paper on why did FDR wait so long to address this issue. But is it an issue of ideology?
No. What I'm saying is that what we are dealing, see, like today, for instance, unlike in China, there is active public discourse on the question of sex selection, which is very important. Like in China, there's still very little public dialogue. So what I'm trying to say is that when Chris Smith talks about China, sir, and I think you need to recognize India is different. And the only way to deal with these problems is to engage, and I think we can make a difference.
I'm not arguing with you on the ideology or the history or the mindset of people in India. I'm asking you to educate me, to inform me as to, is this a factor?
I would argue today, and to be clear, just because there's good law in place does not mean that there is political will on the national level to enforce the laws. I agree with you.
That's my point.
That there is not. And the Supreme Court came down with a decision in March of 2013, this year, saying the political will on a union level and on a state level is non-existent. So the Supreme Court acknowledges exactly what you said, that the political will is not there. There has to be a combination of political will as well as social demand. A social demand for justice, a social demand for change, a social demand to recognize that these girls' lives are every bit as important as boys.
Sure they are. There's no question about that.
Jill, I've just heard, I was in the Supreme Court. I've intervened in this case what Jill is talking about. We had a hearing on 3rd. So what I'm trying to say is that in the state of Maharashtra, where there is, because of these efforts of this lawyer Varsha Deshpande, the political parties are supporting the implementation of the law. So you have an example, sir, where the laws have been taken seriously, and it has made a fact of deterrence.
Okay, let me pose this then. We're going through an issue concerning Syria, and the overwhelming numbers, percentages in the country, in the United States, not to intervene is extraordinary. I've never seen numbers from Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and people who don't even vote so high as to say we do not want to get involved. Now, you're looking for some help from the United States, and the United States, for the most part, is always there to try and help. But how do we sell to the American people the idea of aid of some type or another, whether that's monetary or whether that's people on the ground through USAID or some other entity? How do we convince the American people if the national government in India does not appear to take this seriously? Why are we going to spend the time, the effort, the resources if India isn't taking what I perceive as being the necessary immediate steps to implement the law?
Can I say something?
Please.
On the point of, because for you, and I agree with you, it's a fundamental point. How do we understand why it is that people apparently don't value life? To be fair, it was an American idea to pay people money to agree to sterilization. That was an American idea. And not only that, it was an American economist, working for the Johnson administration who calculated the numbers to come up with how much you should pay parents to agree to sterilization. And the reason for that is that he calculated the future value of an Indian life was less than nothing. And so it was for that reason that he thought that it would make sense, not only for India
Yeah,
to
but
do this.
sterilization is very, very different from murder. Okay? Very different.
A lot of people died through botched sterilization operations.
Granted. Okay, I understand that, but not, and I am not mitigating that at all, but not in the numbers you're talking about what is taking place in India. So that is a very tiny, infinitesimal amount. First of all, I can't imagine. I bet there's nobody in this room that would agree with anything like that today. But let's deal with the facts today that are at hand. There's an abomination taking place in India. Just about every country in the world, when there are problems, whether they like us or not, comes to the United States for help. And we are known for that, and I am proud of that. But again, it's a tough sell. Given the financial crisis that we're in, given the state of affairs around the world, and it sounds to me that the national government can put pressure on the states, who can put pressure on the locals to address this issue, I think, seriously. Am I wrong?
Yes, I think you're correct. And just as we require India to report on what they are doing to eliminate trafficking because of the Trafficking in Persons Protection Act.
So what do we do?
Let's institute something in our government again that requires them and other countries where we see that there is a problem with gendercide to report on what they're doing to protect their girls and what they're doing on a national level to put pressure on the states so that there is no more elimination. So there are no more missing girls.
Does this have anything to do with, I'm sorry, I'm running way over my time, Chairman. Does this have anything to do with trying to stabilize the increase in population in India? Is there an ulterior motive here? Is this, okay, this is a way to resolve one of the major problems that we have?
But it's a very short-sighted way, even if that's been an intended or unintended consequence, because what we are dealing with is incredible increase in violence against surviving women. So therefore, to come up with one problem, to resolve one problem population by creating more violence in the society is no way to resolve it.
I agree with you. Don't think I'm taking an opposite side here. I'm just asking, could that be a thought in the national government's attempt to control the population?
Yes, sir. I mean, that is within sections of
Okay. So it goes to ideology. It goes to, we have problems in India, and I'm just speaking generically. So in a way to deal with those, we're going to turn our head to this catastrophe that's taking place. We know it's an abomination, but it could help stabilize our growing population. I mean, is that, have you ever thought of this, or has anyone ever talked about this?
Absolutely. And I would argue, yes, that is part of the reason why they're turning a blind eye. That and, as Ms. Dutt mentioned, just the preference for sons and the discrimination against girls.
This isn't just a one-factor issue.
Right.
I understand that, but thank you. You've educated me, and I yield back.
Let me ask each of our panelists, this would be a basic yes or no question, whether or not you support or oppose the Preconception and Pre-Diagnostic Techniques Act of 1994 or the PND Act.
You'd have to remind me, I'm sorry.
Sex selection abortion ban.
Oh,
in India.
Yeah, of course I would support it, yes.
You support the act?
Yes.
I just want to get on the record.
Yeah.
Yes.
So let's be very clear. Prenatal Diagnostic Techniques Act. The focus on the act is on the act of determination,
Right.
not on
Right.
So let's be very clear. Here also is this level. The focus of the act is on stopping determination, because the act sees sex selection as discrimination. So we are not dealing with abortion.
So sex selection abortion is not proscribed in India?
Determination of the fetus.
No, but please, so we know absolutely. Is there a law in India that says it's illegal to have a sex selection abortion?
No. What it says, what the law, PND Act, what you mentioned,
Yes.
is against discrimination. It talks about not just it focuses on determination of sex. So it could be the fetal sex, it could be the embryo sex, it could be the preconceptional sex. So determination, because we also have a law, MTP, medical termination of pregnancy, which makes it legal. So the focus of our law is preventing discrimination. So it is not sex-selective abortion.
When you determine the sex of your child, and then you determine that she is a female, and then go have an abortion, that is illegal because you have broken the act in determining the sex of the child. And so, yes, I'm in favor of this act.
Yes, in favor.
Let me ask Dr. Connolly, can you expand on the role USAID historically played in course of population control programs in India? You mentioned Australia's aid agency in your written report, what they do. And what about those other countries such as Sweden, SIDA, and maybe other countries too, if you want
Right.
to touch
Well, USAID played an enormous role in funding population control. In the 1970s, USAID provided more international aid for family planning, so-called, than the rest of the world put together. That said, USAID, unlike, say, Sweden, for instance, and a number of other foreign aid agencies, didn't provide money for incentives for sterilization payments. On the other hand, now I've got three hands. The head of
Dr. Connolly, on the coercive side of it all.
right on the coercive side. Well, for me, paying poor people who are hungry for sterilization is coercion.
We did that in India.
No, actually, USAID did not do that. They did, on the other hand, pay for incentive payments for the providers to carry out these procedures, which, as you can imagine, is rife for abuse.
Historically, were all populations and castes targeted for population control? Were the Dalits, for example, singled out for more abusive treatment?
That's a matter, of great controversy, continuing controversy. If you look at the statistics, from the emergency period, for instance, it does seem that the Dalits were singled out. Whether this was because they were often the poorest, most disenfranchised, or whether it was because they're Dalits, that part is not clear.
Without objection, testimony submitted by Mira Wiesenstahl will be made a part of the record. She couldn't be here today, but wrote an extensive submission for this subcommittee. She points out in her testimony that sex-selective abortion following ultrasound scans is by far the most common means of sex selection worldwide. Do you agree with that?
I don't know that I can verify that about the present, but to my knowledge, that's consistent with what I've seen.
Dr. George?
Yes, sir. Now, if you look at, India is a big country. If you look at China also, there are regional differences. So, sexing started extensively in the private sector in Punjab in 1979. So, when you look at, many other parts of India, southern India, eastern India, the sex selection started later. If you look at my state of Kerala, for instance, even 10 years ago, where the rate of ultrasound usage was the highest in pregnancy, hardly any misuse was being done for sex determination. But in recent years, we are seeing, so it depends on when the sexing started, so when the ratios fall. So therefore, the whole country we cannot say, but what I'm saying is that it depends on where you're looking. So if you're looking at Punjab, Delhi, Haryana, yes, you're right. Sex determination, it becomes the most important cause where post-child neglect is much less, where infanticide is much less. So what I'm trying to say is that in 1981, I came to the US to study nutrition because we saw malnutrition, girl child malnutrition as a big problem. Those days, the sexing was very little, infanticide was very little, but today we see that as sexing becomes more and more of the norm, then these things become very different.
In the studies that I have done through our work, you can see the gender ratio dropping every 10 years in the census. I believe in 2001, between ages of 0 and 6, the girl to boy ratio was 927 to 1,000 boys. In the 2011 census, it's 914 girls to 1,000 boys. And that's, once again, the ages of 0 to 6. And through experts in this field in India, they say that this is a direct product of sex determination through ultrasound, and that is becoming much more prevalent. Now, granted, in our work, we deal with a lot of people who are very, very poor and who cannot afford the sex determination test through ultrasound. And so they are still committing infanticide. And these are people in the rural villages of India. But when people can afford it, they will have sex determination tests done through ultrasound. And they will choose to abort their children, their daughters, because of what they've learned in ultrasound.
I'm afraid I really have to look at the numbers. I mean, I've kind of lost a little bit of the track of what we're saying.
Her question,
Yes,
or
to-
her
Sorry.
declarative sentence was, sex-selective abortion following ultrasound scans is by far the most common means of sex selection worldwide. Do you agree with that?
I really don't. I would really have to look at the numbers. I don't know.
Do that and get back to us for the record. That would be appreciated.
Sure.
She also points out that there has been a spike in trafficking, prostitution, and bride selling in India as an after effect of sex selection abortions and sex selection in general. Mr. Weber just left. He wrote the law in Texas on combating sex trafficking. My good friend and colleague, Mr. Marino, enforced it as the U.S. attorney, enforced my law because I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. We have tried for years to get the U.S. Department of State to focus both on China and India, that there is a nexus between the two. Finally, this year, the administration, and I credit Lucy DeBacca for the ambassador at large for being dogged in trying to ensure that this connection be made. The Trafficking in Persons report for this year, announced in June, and I was at the announcement with Secretary of State John Kerry, made it absolutely clear that this is a major factor in what is becoming an outrageous phenomenon of commodifying women and selling them, because there is a dearth of women. They've been exterminated systematically through sex selection abortion. We have not had a corresponding acceptance of that notion in India. And I'm wondering if any of you could shed light on, as Ms. Wiesenthal points out, she has a whole section on human trafficking and points out that India's impoverished Northeast is a common source of trafficked women, and of course the lack of women, of course, leads to more bride selling and trafficking. Is it your view that, I mean, we're not here to talk about China, but is it your view, or would any of you like to take a stab at the issue of trafficking and sex selection abortion and sex selection in general leading to an exacerbated situation?
I started working on the issue of trafficking and forced prostitution in India in 1982. And I actually did my senior thesis in college at Mount Holyoke on the subject. And at that time, there was very little attention being placed on the issue of trafficking. And one was also looking at the phenomenon of mail order brides to the United States from various Southeast Asian countries, and returning GIs and soldiers marrying women and bringing them back. And so, my experience with the issue of trafficking and forced prostitution goes back, obviously, several decades. And I'm not entirely sure that I would be willing to say that there is a cause and effect relationship between gender-biased sex selection and trafficking in women and girls, because my work on that started a long time ago, and the current statistics on that situation did not exist then. I think that the issue of gender-biased sex selection and trafficking in women and girls are both manifestations of gender-based discrimination, which has multiple roles, as we've discussed earlier in the testimony. And I think to make the connection, this sort of direct causal relationship between gender-biased sex selection and trafficking, of course the unequal sex ratio is leading to other kinds of consequences. But to say that this is a consequence of that rather than underlying patriarchy and gender-based discrimination, I think is incorrect.
With all due respect, you would disagree with the U.S. Department of State's finding that it is a cause of sex trafficking. The absence of women and
I don't
because
think
of
I
their-
don't think it's a cause. I think that the problem is gender-based discrimination and the objectification of women, and the fact that men are not raised to look at women and girls differently. I think the problem really is how men view women, if we really want to talk about the causes of the problems that we're facing today.
But with skewed ratios and the absence of women to marry, and again, both India and China have enormously skewed ratios. Others are joining those ranks, not quite as much so. You don't believe that leads to entrepreneurs, nefarious entrepreneurs at that, who turn women into commodities and buy and certainly sell them.
The trafficking industry uses whatever factors it can. It uses
We're talking
poverty.
about a dearth of women who then...
Well,
in
that
these-
is one of many, many factors. To say there's a causal relationship between one and the other, and to ignore patriarchy and gender-based
Who's
discrimination.
ignoring? That's a straw man's argument. I'm not ignoring any other issues. What I'm suggesting is that when the women don't exist because they've been systematically exterminated through sex selection abortion, and again, Ms. Wiesenstahl points out that that is by far the largest cause of the missing girls worldwide, it certainly leads to people looking for women who don't exist, and then in come the pimps who sell these women to the nearest buyer. Ms.
Yeah, but
McElroy,
trafficking
if you could speak
existed
to that.
before that.
I'm out of time almost. Oh, of course it's gotten worse, demonstrably worse. Again, as I wrote that law, finally the State Department has recognized it, and we're hoping they'll recognize it vis-a-vis India, and they have not yet.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. As I wrote in my statement, and I touched on briefly today in my oral statement before the committee, yes, there you can see a correlation. There is, because there are 37 million men who will never find wives, there has to be a result, and the result is trafficking. Studies show trafficking, violence against women, marrying of child brides. The percentage of young girls who get married in India, it's 47% below the age of 18 who are married off to these men because they're looking for women to marry. And so there is a correlation. I mean, I think that you have to recognize that trafficking is a result of what is going on in this discrimination against girls and women through sex-selective abortion, through infanticide, through feticide.
Well, to borrow an inconvenient or a someone else's word, it is an inconvenient truth, in my opinion. It is almost as plain as the nose of my face that when the women don't exist because they've been exterminated in utero, that men who are looking for a woman, unfortunately, are more easily susceptible to those, again, nefarious networks of pimps who sell them. Dr. Conley, did you want to speak on that? Or?
Well, one thing I know about trafficking is that it's notoriously difficult to get accurate statistics. One thing about sex ratios is that we have very good data. These are vital statistics, and so we can keep close track of it and track the change over time. Whereas reporting on sex trafficking is a statistician's nightmare. So it's a little hard, to verify a causal relationship between the two.
Well, it took the State Department a long time on China,
Mhm.
but they finally have come to that conclusion, and it's in their most recent report, and the Obama administration absolutely does not agree with my view on the sanctity of an unborn child's life, but nevertheless they came to that conclusion that there is a nexus between the two. I want to thank all of you for your testimony. I think it's been a very spirited and I think robust discussion. It's not the end of it. I do believe that violence against the unborn child or the newborn child, who happens to be female or anyone else, cries out for protection. It is human rights are nothing if they're not for all. And so again, Ms. Dutt, I would respectfully disagree with you on your view, but I do believe passionately that abortion is violence against children and it is injurious to women. And again, it has made this issue of missing girls demonstrably worse. And that's, I think, a matter of statistics that are unassailable. Thank you so much for your testimony. I am going to try to make that vote, which I may have missed. I really appreciate your providing the insights that you have today. Hearing is adjourned.